Oh, hello there. Welcome to Introduction to Anthropology Home Edition, Week 3. The topic for this week is gender and families. How do these two things relate to one another? Why did he use gender in the plural? What the heck does gender and families have to do with culture and anthropology? Stay tuned to find out. First, I'm going to walk you through the various things that are available to you on the course web this week. Here we go. Remember that email that you received that you probably clicked through to start watching this, you'll be able to find that here in announcements always. It will be pinned to the top so that each week you'll be able to see the instructions. If we scroll down to here we are, this week's materials and assignments. The first thing that I think you should probably do, because it's easy, would be to do the next installment of the virtual fieldwork project, wherein I ask you to analyze and reflect upon and analyze the operation of power in the culture that you're representing. You'll recall that power is the ability to influence the behavior of others, to constrain their choices, and to shape the outcome of social interactions. Basically, power influences how we behave. Sometimes we are in a position of power, but more often, however, we alter our behavior in response to the power of others. So power operates in all cultures. Sometimes power might operate in a very formal way, such as the power relationship that exists between parents and children, teachers and students, police and citizens. Other times, power might be a lot more informal in its organization and its structure, and sometimes it may even appear that there is no power operating in in a culture, in a community of people that share beliefs and practices. But yet, I suspect that you'll find when you reflect upon why people do what they do in your culture, that they are being influenced by some sort of power. And what I want you to do here is to think about what the sources of that power are, and what scale it seems to operate at. And then I want you to ask yourself, why do people who participate in the culture that you are representing submit to this power? The answer might be very simple, because they need a paycheck. Alternatively, the answer might be a little bit more, require a little bit more thought and be a little bit more nuanced. Why do the members, why do the group of people that you hang out with when you go to parties on Friday night always seem to do what one person wants to do? Why does that person get to call the shots? Anyway, think about it, write about it, and that's that. Then, well, you're watching this now, but that's where it resides. And I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about gender and families and how these things relate to culture. I'm going to do that just now. Gender and families. I really need like a little intro sound, or maybe I should get a soundboard with one of those wah-wah noises. We'll see what I can come up with for next time. So, as we begin every class, we remind ourselves that culture is both beliefs and practices, things that people think and also things that people do that are learned among members of a community, that are shared, or that are learned, that are shared among members of a community. They're patterned because different cultures do things differently. They're adaptive because they allow us to get by in the world, help us get by in the world, and they are symbolic because they have greater meaning. what the heck does this have to do with gender and families? Well, we have to begin by recognizing the difference between sex and gender. The reading, the main reading, textbook type reading for class for this week here, this one, does a really great job discussing some of the differences between gender and sex. I'm highlighting where you can find some of the things that I'm talking about. It's a fairly long article. It's really, really great. And it concludes with a handy dandy glossary. So this will come in really handy as you write the assignments and even as you listen to what I'm talking about now. So I would recommend that you take a look through this before you continue. But back at it. One of the things that article talks about is the way in which the meaning of these words has changed. For a generation ago, sex and gender were used interchangeably. Today, they continue to be used interchangeably in a lot of contexts. Social scientists, however, including anthropologists, have for quite a while used sex and gender in specifically different ways. Sex refers to the biological differences, the difference in the physical parts, in the chromosomes and in the hormones, the differences between male and female bodies. Humans, like all mammals, are a sexually reproducing species, and most of us come in one of two varieties. Of course, in something as complex as the human body, there is a tremendous amount of overlap and the possibility of individuals, something on the order of 1 in 1,000 people being born with a little bit of mixing and matching between external organs and chromosomes and hormone levels, and these folks are referred to as transgender. But for the most part, sex refers to the biological difference between male and female bodies. Gender, on the other hand, are the cultural practices that are learned, shared, patterned, adaptive, and deeply symbolic. The cultural practices that are associated with sexed bodies. And that includes ideas of what's natural for different types of people, what's acceptable behavior for men and women and boys and girls, the expected roles in society, etc. And like I said, these things these sex and gender are so often used interchangeably that it's important for me to tell you about this, that this is common standard usage in social sciences. But even in medicine, it gets mixed up. As I've mentioned in class to you before, I about 2 years ago, I had a kid. My daughter's about 2 years old. And throughout our experience of preparing for her to be born and all of our engagement with medical professions related to that, it just drove me nuts when I had to fill out a form that asked for her gender when what they really meant was what is her sex. And anyway, I digress. One of my goals for this week was to be more concise, but I seem to be going off on little tangents. That's all right. It's really important for us, however, to recognize that gender is a cultural thing. Because if gender is a collection of beliefs and practices that are learned and shared among members of a community, it is obvious then that they are patterned, and that people in different places and different times and even different social spaces within society have different learned, shared beliefs and practices related to gender. Cultural beliefs and practices having to do with gender change through time. So, for example, in North American society, in United States society, it is almost, it seems natural that pink is a color associated with little girls, and blue is a color associated with little boys. But that set of ideas only really came to be in the 1950s and 60s. And it has as much to do with the marketing of different clothing to little boys and little girls by department stores. Prior to that, prior to World War II, mostly, little boys and little girls pretty much wore the same stuff, and it was mostly white, which meant that if you had a little boy, you could hand all the clothes down to your daughter, and vice versa. Well, if you want to sell people twice as many clothes, and then you start picking colors. And at first, there was no clear dichotomy between pink and blue for boys and girls, but it has since come to be that way. There was no smoke-filled room where people sat down and decided that this is how it was going to go, but it was a set of ideas about color that came to be widely accepted and are now learned by little children as they walk through the toy aisle, and they will pass it on to their children unless they stop and think about it. So in that way, something that many of us think of as natural is in fact cultural. It has a history, and it is different than it used to be, and it's different than it is in other places. So that's just a very benign and somewhat innocuous example, but it'll help you remember. What does this have to do with families? Well, families are groups of people that are related by descent, marriage, or adoption. And I'm going to explain that briefly. But when I ask this in class, when we're having sort of the opening class discussion about this stuff, ask, well, who's in your family? What makes a family? And almost universally, students in the class will say, well, it has to do with blood. Families are people that you're related to by blood. And from your perspective, from many students' perspective anyway, as a young person who is unattached, that's the aspect of family that makes the most sense. Right? You have a mother and you have a father. That's something that is pretty much universal in the human species. Those people, we say, we're related to by blood, which is actually a metaphor for descent. And that's the aspect of family that's most relevant to many folks. But now think about it from someone else's perspective, like your mom's perspective or your dad's perspective. Now, they might, if they are still married, which only describes about 50% of families in the United States, families, from that perspective, is comprised of marriage relationships. So that the whole point in our society is that mom and dad are not supposed to be related by blood or descent. So descent and marriage are equally important in the construction of families, and of course, universally, families bring others into the family by means of adoption. And when that happens, usually the people who are adopted into the family are assigned a certain set of roles. And this person is like your mother or father. This person is like then your aunt, uncle, etc. So when someone is adopted into a family, they have this whole set of relationships that they take on as if they were born into it. Having said that, it might seem that family structures are natural. They're biological. Because it takes a male of the species and a female of the species to produce a child. So marriage and descent. Marriage, however, is a social contract, oftentimes a legal contract that spells out
the rights and obligations of the two people who have produced a child to one another and to that child. Right? Think about all of the things that happen in a family court. These relate to those rights and obligations in the United States, and those rights and obligations are tied up in the legally binding contract of marriage. This is something that is remarkably universal around the globe, but is not something that is done the same way in different places. I'm being a little bit cryptic, but some of the things that I've asked you to read for today or for this week are examples of ways in which people belonging to cultures in different places have done marriage differently, had different ideas about who can marry who and how many people are involved, etc. So for many of us who were raised in the context of the United States, where the nuclear family is an ideal, it might seem natural. Now, of course, this doesn't describe everyone's family. More something on the order of 50% or 55% of marriages in the United States dissolve within 5 years, which means most of us have parents who have divorced and remarried. So when I say that the nuclear family is the ideal in the United States, I do not mean that is the right or correct or the only way to do families, to have families, but rather it's the ideal against which families are measured. And that nuclear family ideal is exemplified in The Simpsons and in almost every sitcom since the 1950s, since TV was invented. That's why The Simpsons works as a satire, is because it can be referential to almost every sitcom ever. And that's how you know that something is a powerful idea, is when it's that widely shared. Right? Your family may not be organized this way. Many families are not, but it is an ideal that anyone who's been raised in the United States in the context of our popular culture recognizes as the sort of standard or ideal form of family. And that's Homer and Marge are unrelated to one another by descent. They marry one another, they produce children, and that unit lives together in a house. That's the nuclear family. Get it? Homer works in a nuclear plant. It's a nuclear family. And that might seem natural, but it's not. Small tweaks in even the names, the terms that are used to describe people to whom we are related by blood or descent can have major ramifications in terms of who is family and who is not family. So in class, anthropologists have developed a system of notation, a way to make a diagram to describe how families are related. I'm going to show you one on the next slide. If we were doing this in class, I'd be drawing on the board like I was diagramming out football plays. But I can talk through this. So I have one brother. Is he part of my family? Well, yes. Because we were raised in the context of the nuclear family. We have the same parents. He has a wife. Her name's Missy. What's her relationship to me? She's my sister-in-law. She's kind of like a sister, but because she's married to my brother, we say sister-in-law. I have some rights and obligations to them, such that I also in class would call it the asshole principle applies. If, God forbid, something happened to my brother and sister-in-law, they have two wonderful daughters, my nieces, would it be expected that I step in, my family steps in to help my nieces? Definitely. They're part of my family. It would even be a legal obligation were I to be the next of kin. And if I didn't, I would be an asshole. Now, my sister-in-law, Missy, has a sister, Nikki. What is she to me? my sister-in-law's sister. I can describe that, but we don't have a word for that. She has a husband, Mark. Are they part of my family? Kinda. I see them on holidays. But we don't have a word for what they are to me. Right? We don't have a kinship term. And the asshole principle does not apply, such that, God forbid, something were to happen to my sister-in-law's sister and her husband, Mark and Nikki. They also have two wonderful daughters, who I can only describe as my sister-in-law's sister's kids, because we don't have a term for that. In no way would I be legally responsible if, God forbid, something happened to them. I would not be considered next of kin in American family law. Also, the asshole principle would not apply. There would be plenty of other people who would be expected to step in to help out there, were, God forbid, something to happen. Now, what if, and this is a real example, what if we changed a few rules and we treated marriage relationships the same as descent relationships? What I mean to say is, if instead of calling my brother's wife my sister-in-law, we just called her my sister, that would make her sister my sister and her husband my brother. Now, Mark and Nikki's kids are my nieces. The asshole principle applies. And if we, in our society, in our culture, used those terms, then the asshole principle would apply, and I would absolutely have an obligation to my sister, what we call my sister-in-law's sister's kids. That's actually a real example of the way in which the Dakota people, Native American people from the Dakotas, earlier on, traditionally, constructed families. So that they, at the time that this kinship system was in wide use, I mean, it's still in wide use, but it developed in the context before colonization of them having been big game hunters of buffalo. So that when a large animal is caught, is killed, needs to be distributed back at camp, there's a whole bunch of brothers and sisters and nephews and nieces who, it's very clear, all must be able to participate in the consumption of that animal. Would that way of life, would that type of kinship system work for us as exemplified by The Simpsons and the nuclear family? Well, probably not, because that would mean you'd have to have an open door policy to your kitchen, your fridge, and your bank account for a lot more people than most families can afford. That's and a way to understand that small difference in kinship terminology between the Dakota people traditionally and American American post-war 20th century culture is that most of us live in the context of capitalism, where there's supposed to be a free flow of labor, so that when you graduate from here and you get a job, you got to be prepared to go where the job is. Take your family with you. How many of y'all have moved at some point because mom or dad got relocated by their company? The whole American nuclear family system is designed to have small mobile units that are largely self-sufficient. And again, there was no smoke-filled room where a bunch of men sat down and figured out how this was going to be. It's just developed in the context of our economic system and our culture, so that these learned, shared ideas seem natural, but they're not. They're cultural. they're patterned. People done things differently, such that the Dakota people had a mostly similar kinship system, but with a few tweaks extended their families almost indefinitely, so that folks living together could almost all be related to someone, to everyone that they live with somehow. Hence the need for large yearly gatherings to try to find folks for the youngins to get married to who they're not related to. A way of social networking. Briefly talked about this a bit among the Jukwasi or Kong people, who again have a somewhat similar way of arranging families that we do. But they have the named relationship, so that if you meet somebody with your same name, your same first name, then you have all of their relatives too. And it's a way of expanding social networks. Now, I said that both the Dakota and the Kong people had families that are arranged somewhat similar to ours. And what I mean by that is that they have a bilateral kinship organization, so that neither mom's side of the family nor dad's side of the family takes precedence. That's very different from unilineal families. Unilineal families place a clear emphasis on either mom's side or dad's side of the family, so that if you were born into a family that was arranged like this, you would very clearly belong to either your mom's family or your dad's family, depending upon the gender roles that are expected of you. So I want you to watch this film. It's really fantastic. It takes place in the 1980s in the Indian state of Haryana. It's in northern India. It's very close to where I did my field work with the butchers. I'm very familiar with families that are organized like this. People continue to organize family like this. They continue to have the gender roles that are expected in a family like this. And I think the major difference between the 1980s when this film was made and now in a rural village in Haryana is that they'd have flat screen TVs and mobile phones, smartphones, instead of what you see in the film. Now, Dottie's family is an example of a unilineal family, specifically a patrilineal family. Again, you can find this vocabulary at the end of that article. And what that means is that the family is defined by the father's line. This is a kinship diagram. And in anthropological kinship diagrams, biological males are represented with a triangle, here representing Dada. Dada is the term for grandfather in Hindi. That's the language spoken in Haryana by these folks. And a circle is a representation of a biological female. The equal sign here means that they are married to one another, and the line down here is the children that they have, they have descended from them, so marriage and descent. And in a patrilineal family, only the sons will always be members of that family. The daughters, when they get married, and here they're expected to be married to someone from a different village, they then become members of their husband's family. So obviously, they're still related. They're still the daughters of Dada and Dadi, and they're the sisters of Meherlal and Mohinder, their brothers, but they do not live with them. They live with their husbands' families and their husbands' parents, and they are recognized as members of that family. So that's similar to the way that Darshini and Sita, their daughters-in-law of Dadi's family, they are very much culturally and legally members of Dada's family. Right, so when they got married, they left their home, the families that they were born into, and moved into a new family. Their children, boys and girls, sons and daughters, are very much of Dada's family. and the granddaughter, Mohinder and Sita's daughter, Dada and Dadi's granddaughter, will eventually someday move out into into her husband's family in a different village. And part of the reason that this unilineal family structure has developed in this region is because agriculture is their primary occupation of this community in rural India. And so agriculture depends upon land, and it is incredibly important to have a very clear line of inheritance for land. So this set of beliefs and practices related to who belongs in the family, who's not part of the family, and how land and resources are transmitted from one generation to another generation within the family seems natural to people who were raised in this way. But we, as outsiders, see it as clearly cultural. It relates to family, but as you see in the film and as you participate in the discussion forums, it also very much influences beliefs and practices related to sexed bodies, sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, so on and so forth. So that you will see cultural beliefs and practices related to gender operating very differently in this family. They're intimately related, family and gender. So, I'm back. Now that you've watched this, I'd like you to then watch this, Dottie's Family, read this. This is a textbook chapter that everything you could ever, well, not everything you could ever want to know, but a whole lot of stuff about sex and gender as it relates to anthropology. And here are two fantastic examples. One is about arranging a marriage in India, and the other is about when brothers share a wife, which makes me realize that I didn't specifically talk about marriage. So I am going to pause this. Actually, I'm going to continue on doing this, and then I'll record another short little thing about marriage and tack it on at the end. So once you've watched this, read these, then I would say go to the discussion forum and think about this stuff and how it plays out in how gender is related to habitus. Think about some examples of gendered practice in our campus culture, gendered practice in the film, how they're similar or different, how Dottie's family is similar or different to yours, and relationship between family and gendered practice. You'll answer the question. You'll then be able to see what other people wrote, and it will allow you to write a better assignment for the week. Very straightforward. I just want you to be sure to read and to write about the difference between sex and gender, so that you can talk like a grown-up to social scientists, that is to say historians, anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, etc. Arranged marriage. What is it, and why would somebody participate in such a system? They don't do it at gunpoint. Fraternal polyandry, related to this next article, and the last two questions relate to the film, so you really have to watch it. Referring to this is the part I'm going to tack on here. Referring to the film Dottie's Family, why do you think that Dada and Dottie may have thought an arranged marriage for Meherlal and Mohinder, their first two sons, but supported a love marriage for their youngest son? Maybe I'm not going to, I see that I've gotten already on to 35 minutes, so maybe I'm not going to tack on another thing. But yeah, in many parts of the world, many cultures, but this all relates to South Asia, arranged marriages are the default. such that if somebody just says, I'm getting married, you presume that it is an arranged marriage. These days, for middle class folks, there is, it's kind of like a parent arranged dating service, and kids have lots of choice about it. Their parents will put together a long list and they'll wheedle it down to a short list, and there will be meetings and all sorts of family gatherings, and eventually a decision will be made. Love marriages are seen as oftentimes seen as something that is unacceptable, at least among older generations. So that I have friends who had love marriages, and their parents kind of lied to their grandparents about it. You know what I mean? So their parents might have been accepting of their marrying someone that they met at college or wherever, but grandma and grandpa expect to have an arranged marriage. So this is something that can cause some tension in the family, and even among Dada and Dadis, very seemingly traditional conservative farm family in rural India in the 1980s, even there, they allowed and supported the marriage of the love marriage of their youngest son. And you actually get to see some shots from the wedding in the film, like their love marriage of Rajinder, their youngest son, is an important plot point in the documentary. Not plot point, but the narrative hinges on it. So that's some stuff I want you to read about and think about for this week.